With this video, I want to go into a little more detail when it comes to sharpening in Lightroom, but I also want to show you a bunch of other options which you can use for ultra sharp images in Photoshop. As always, I will be showing the whole editing process for this image, so if you're just here for the tutorial part, make sure to check the chapters because sharpening mostly happens at the end of the editing process. Also, you can follow along by downloading the raw file from the link in the description of the video, and now let's begin. Okay, first let's do the raw adjustments. You can see this image is super dirty. Yes, there is a lot of dust on my sensors, so we need to clean that up. First, let's click on remove. Here we want to go into distraction removal and go into dust and choose apply. This is a newly added feature, but as you can see, it will not get every single dust spot, so we need to do that manually. I'm going to use the heel brush up here, and I'm just going to brush over this big one. And let's brush away a few others as well. Now there are also some distracting things right here which I'm going to clean up. I'm going to use the remove tool for that. Make sure to use generative AI. And then I'm just going to brush over this thing right here. This is super annoying to me. And I also want to remove that weird spot right here overlapping that field. Okay, once this is done, let's click on remove. That's looking much better, and there we have the cleaned up image. So next up, the basic adjustments. Let's go through them real quick. I'm not changing the profile for this scene. I think the colors are quite good. I just need to fine tune the exposure right now. What I'm going to do first is to bring up the exposure, making everything just a little bit brighter. I kind of want to keep this image on the darker side. Still, I want to brighten up everything first. Next, I'm going to drop the highlights, which will give us more details in the sky. So right around here looks great. I think we could raise the shadows just to get out some more details from the darkest parts. And I'm also going to raise the blacks for the same effect, just not too much. I want to keep the contrast rather high for this shot. But this is looking really good. Now after the tonal adjustments, I usually do the white balance adjustment, so let's do that. Right away you can see this image has a really strong blue color cast, so usually I'm going to bring up the temperature for that, introducing more warmth this way. However, for this scene I think the blue color cast actually looks pretty good. I still want to bring up the temperature to bring back a little bit of warmth, but not too much. I think I dial it back down a little. So I want to find a nice balance between the cold and warm tones somewhere. I think that's a great spot. Let's go with that for now. We can always go back and change it later. We can also bring up the vibrance and the saturation to boost those colors a little more. Alright. As I said in the intro, general sharpening is something that's kind of happening towards the end of the editing process, but we can work towards a sharper image way before the end. For example, right here in the presence tab, we do have a bunch of different sliders, which will help increase the contrast and thus make the image appear to look sharper. What I like to use is the texture slider. I always raise it just a little bit, which will really give those details some more sharpness. Especially smaller things like grass blades or those tree branches right here in the distance. Another thing we could use is clarity, which does help give things a little more punch, but to me most of the times clarity isn't fine enough. So I'm not going to push clarity in this case. Instead I want to drop it because negative clarity helps adding some kind of subtle glow on top of this image. Something like this looks pretty good. And finally, we have dehaze. As the name suggests, it is used to dehaze an image, but of course, if you bring it up, you can see the contrast will be pushed in a very unique way. And I think for this image, it's working quite well. So let's bring up the dehaze a little bit. You can also see it's shifting the colors of this shot, but in a very nice way, since we get a more intense blue look in the foreground, and this will just help with the colder overall look of the scene. So I think that's it for the basic adjustments. We can take a look comparing to before real quick. Of course, it looks much cleaner without those ugly sensor spots. Don't worry, I already ordered another sensor cleaning kit, so sensor spots shouldn't be a problem in the upcoming videos. The white balance is also much better with a little more warmth, but we still have the blue tones left, which is great. Now we can take a look at the masking adjustments, focusing on a few areas locally. So let's go ahead, open up the masking menu. And right away, I want to make the sky more dramatic. So I'm going to use a linear gradient. I'm going to cover pretty much everything except for these warmer tones at the bottom. In here, I'm going to bring down the exposure. And I'm also raising the contrast, which will help with the cloud structure. And maybe we could even bring up the clarity again, just to make the cloud structure more visible. Okay, nice. I'm going to use another linear gradient right away on top. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, but again, I want to apply pretty much the same things. I'm going to bring down the exposure, making the very top of the sky darker. And I'm going to bring up the contrast again. So something like that looks great. I do not only want to work on the top of the sky, I also want to make the bottom, the brighter area of the sky, a little bit brighter and give it more warmth, because the brighter areas should be warmer. So I'm going to use a sky selection mask. And since I only want to affect the bottom part, we need to modify this mask. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient, taking out everything from the top, which we just made darker. In here, I'm going to start by bringing up the exposure very gently. We really don't want to overexpose in here, but a little more brightness looks much better. Then, to add warmth, we're going to use the temperature slider and simply bring it up. Alright, that's looking really good. I'm also going to use the thin slider and bring it up, introducing more of an orange color tone instead of a yellow tone. So let's go with that. We can also bring up the saturation a bit just to push those colors. Okay, I also want to work on the foreground. I'm going to use another sky selection for that. And of course, we don't want to work on the sky. So I'm going to invert this selection, which will give us a nice mask for the landscape. I do want to modify it by subtracting a brush. And I just want to get rid of these tree branches like this. I want to make those frosty areas just a bit brighter, which in my opinion just looks really cool. I'm going to bring up the highlights for that, which will make only the brighter areas brighter. It will not affect the shadows. So this will give the foreground a lot more punch. We can also use the whites for the same effect, but I don't want to bring up the whites too much, just a little like that. We can also bring up the texture for some extra sharpness in here. And it seems like there's a little bit of clipping going on in the foreground. So let's see if I bring up the blacks, if that fixes anything. So let's slightly raise the blacks just to be safe. Okay, nice. I also want to make the very near foreground a bit darker, which will help focusing the viewer's eye more towards the center. I'm using another linear gradient for that, just targeting the very near foreground. And I don't want to bring down the exposure because then we end up with clipping again. So what I want to do is to bring down the whites, which will make the brighter areas right here darker. Perfect. Finally, let's add a bit of glow coming in from the left side. I'm using a radial gradient, trying to cover the brightest spot right here. I'm placing the center outside of the image to get a more natural effect. And for the glow effect, let's bring up the blacks. And let's make the glow effect more intense by bringing down the dehaze. And I also want to bring up the temperature just to make the glow look a bit warmer. And maybe let's even raise the exposure for a little more brightness. Alright, perfect. I think that's it for the masking adjustments. Let me turn off all the masks so you can see the difference from before to after. That is so much better. Now that we're done with the masking adjustments, let's do a little bit of color grading, and I want to go into the color mixer first, working on the hue for a moment. For this image, the blue tones are really important, and at the moment they do have a lot of purple in them. I want to reduce that just a little bit, so I'm going to take the blue hue and I'm going to very carefully drop it, which will give us a purer blue color in the sky especially. At the same time, I'm going to use the purple hue and I'm going to bring it up a bit, which will make some of these warmer tones in the sky even warmer, kind of creating some more color contrast between warm and cold in the sky especially. Alright, that's looking great. Let's go over into the saturation tab. I want to boost the warmer tones, so I'm starting with red. Let's also boost orange and let's slightly boost the yellow tones. At the same time, I want to tone down the blue saturation just a little bit. And again, I'm going to bring up the purple tones to balance things a little more. Alright, that's looking nice. We can also apply some split toning in the color grading tab. Here I want to use the highlights and the midtones to apply a little more warmth. So we're going to set up the hue with a warm color tone somewhere in the red range, and let's bring up the saturation here. I want to make it really colorful. I'm going to raise the saturation quite a lot therefore, and that's looking really nice. Let's go into the midtones again. Use a warm color tone in the red color range. And of course we don't want to overdo it with the saturation for the midtones, so I'm just going to slightly bring them up. Alright, and finally let's head down into the calibration tab. Here bring down the blue primary hue and let's bring up the saturation. That's something I do for most of my images because I like how the colors change with these settings right here. Alright, that's it for the color grading, and now we're coming to the tutorial part about the sharpening. Of course, with photo editing there are many ways to do the same thing. Especially with sharpening, there are countless methods to do this. My preferred way is doing it in Lightroom through the Details tab. So let's go ahead, open it up. Here the sharpening is pretty straightforward. We do have the amount of sharpening, which of course is the strength of the sharpening effect. But we do have other sliders as well. So let's talk about radius. By default, the radius tells Lightroom to sharpen 1 pixel around every edge it can find. If I bring the radius up, Lightroom will sharpen 3 pixels around edges, which is way too much because then the sharpening effect will get super obvious. So instead, I'm always going to drop the radius all the way down to 0.5 pixels. So basically, we are sharpening 0.5 pixels around all these edges, which will get us super fine results. Now the detail slider controls the amount of sharpening applied to the details in your photo. Bringing down the details like this, only larger edges will get sharpened. But if we bring up the detail slider, even the smallest details will get sharpened. You can see that kind of in the sky where we now have a highly visible noise pattern. But we can eliminate that by using masking. With masking, we can kind of target the details of this image and filter out areas which don't have much details, like the sky in this case. You can see when I bring it up like that, the sky won't have this noise pattern anymore. To know where the sharpening will be applied, it's vital to hold down the Alt key while adjusting the masking slider. So you get this overlay and everything that's white will get sharpened. So I want to go with something like that. And once you have set up radius, detail and masking, I always like to bring up the amount of sharpening. Depending on how high you bring it up, you will get other patterns along edges. Of course, I never go as high as it is right now, but you can push the sharpening quite a bit. If you have a little bit of a pattern along edges, I personally don't think that's a big deal. You will not notice this, especially when viewing this image online. And this video is mostly for web sharpening. I'm not talking about printing. That's a different story. But for web sharpening, you can push the amount quite a bit before it really affects quality when looking at the image on Instagram, for example. So that's my preferred way of sharpening an image. But of course I get comments every now and then telling me Lightroom sharpening is trash and I should use Photoshop. I know you have way more control with Photoshop sharpening. I just don't want to do it because Lightroom sharpening is enough for my needs. Anyway, let me show you a different way of sharpening you can use in Photoshop. For that, let's right click on the image, go to Edit In and choose Edit in Photoshop. Inside of Photoshop, I want to show you 2 ways which we can sharpen this image. I always start by duplicating this layer. So hit Ctrl J and then let's do it the proper way. We want to convert this layer into a smart object. For that, right click on the layer and click on Convert to Smart Object. Then go into the filter menu. Here go to Sharpen and choose Unsharp Mask. What Unsharp Mask will do is it will increase the image contrast along edges of objects. Again, we do have a mount and a radius slider. Making the radius bigger, just like in Lightroom, will give you some weird looks. So usually I go with the radius around 0.5 to 0.8 pixels maybe. But that depends on a few other things like image size and of course also your personal preferences. So let's keep it a little bit lower. I'm going with the radius of 0.5 pixels. And then with the amount, again, we don't want to push it too much. So let's maybe go with around 90. And then I usually have the threshold set to 0. And by the way, it's always a good idea to have the preview right here enabled just to see what's happening. Alright, and once you have dialed in the settings, just hit OK. And if you want to play around with these settings, because we are working on a smart object, you can always go back, double clicking on this Unsharp mask filter and readjust these settings. So that's really useful. But there's another way, which is a really common way to sharpen things. So let's again take the background layer, duplicate it by hitting Ctrl J. Then we want to convert it into a smart object once more and go up into the filter menu. Now we want to go to Other, and here we're going to choose High Pass. High Pass will detect edges in your image. So if I bring up the radius, you can see these edges getting more and more visible. Again, for fine sharpening, we want to work with low radius. So let's go with 0.8, I would say. Again, that's highly dependent on image size and your personal preferences, so you really need to play around with the radius and give it a few tries with different settings. Of course, at the moment this still does look weird, but let's just click OK. What we can see here in this image are all the finer edges. So in order to sharpen this image, we need to change the blending mode. So click in this drop-down menu right here. And here we can choose a bunch of different blending modes. Usually I'm going with overlay, but you could also use soft light, for example. Now let's go with overlay. You might think not much has changed, but once I deactivate this layer, you will see a difference. From before, which is now looking kind of blurry, to after, which has a super nice fine sharpening to it. The great thing about this is you can always apply a layer mask and mask out certain areas where you don't want to have the sharpening applied, like for example the sky. To do that, I would go back to the base layer, go to select and choose select sky. And with the sky selection, I'm going back to the layer mask of our high pass layer, hit Shift F5 and choose black and hit OK. This way we are masking out the sky from our sharpening layer, and thus we're just having way more control where the sharpening is applied. That's why Photoshop is much better if you want to have the best image quality and sharpening compared to Lightroom. But as I said, this is on such a fine level that pretty much nobody will notice it when viewing the image online. Alright, so I hope this little tour into the world of sharpening in Lightroom and Photoshop will help you with your images. If you found this video helpful and you want to support this channel, feel free to like, subscribe and maybe even leave a comment on this video. Thank you so much for watching and see you all next time.